The wedding ring slipped from Jacob Mackenzie's trembling fingers, disappearing into the freshly turned earth beside two wooden crosses. 8 years had passed since he'd returned from his army scouting mission to find his wife Sarah and infant son Thomas already buried, victims of a cholera outbreak that had swept through their Colorado settlement like wildfire. The neighbors who'd promised to watch over them had fled at the first sign of sickness, leaving his family to die alone and afraid. Now, as autumn winds howled through the mountain pines surrounding his isolated cabin, Jacob lived with a truth that gnawed at his soul. He'd chosen duty over the people who needed him most. Every sunrise brought the same crushing weight, the knowledge that his uniform, his honor, his service to country had meant nothing when measured against empty arms and a cold bed. He'd built these mountains into his fortress, but they'd become his prison. Some wounds never heal, they just teach you to bleed quietly. And on this particular morning, as frost painted his windows like tears, Jacob had no idea that 3 desperate strangers hiding in his storage shed would force him to choose between his carefully constructed isolation and everything he'd sworn never to risk again. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. The frost crunched beneath Jacob Mackenzie's worn boots as he checked the last trap on his morning route. 8 years of this same ritual, up before dawn, coffee black as tar, then into the whispering pine mountains, where silence was his only companion. The October air bit sharp against his weathered face, but he welcomed the sting. Pain meant he was still alive, still breathing, still carrying the weight of choices that had hollowed him out like a carved-out tree. His calloused fingers worked the trap mechanism with practiced efficiency. Empty again, the animals were getting smarter. Or maybe winter was coming earlier this year. Either way, it meant another lean month ahead. But Jacob had survived worse, much worse. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the early sunlight as he reset the snare. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, he was 26 again, watching Sarah laugh as she tried to teach their infant son Thomas to clap his tiny hands. The memory hit like a punch to the gut, as it always did. Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd been gone for 3 weeks on that scouting mission for the Army, tracking Confederate sympathizers through the Colorado Territory. 3 weeks that had stretched into eternity when he'd returned to find 2 wooden crosses and an empty cabin. Cholera, the neighbors had said, swept through like wildfire. Nothing anyone could do, but Jacob knew better. He could have done something. He should have been there. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the mountain stillness as he shouldered his rifle and headed back toward the cabin. 8 years of self-imposed exile hadn't dulled the edge of that guilt. If anything, the isolation had sharpened it into something that cut deeper with each passing season. His cabin came into view through the pine trees, solid logs, tight chinking, a stone chimney that drew smoke straight up into the crisp air. Everything built with his own hands. Everything designed to keep the world out. He'd made this place his fortress, but lately it felt more like a tomb. Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. The door to his storage shed hung slightly ajar, moving gently in the morning breeze. Impossible. He was meticulous about such things. Had to be when living alone. Every door latched, every window secured, every detail controlled because control was all he had left. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his shoulder as he approached the shed. Could be a bear, though they usually made more noise. Could be thieves, though there wasn't much worth stealing this far from civilization. Could be. A soft whimper from inside the shed froze the blood in his veins. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly pushed the door open wider. In the dim light, filtering through gaps in the wooden slats, he could make out two small figures huddled in the far corner. Girls, by the look of them, though their faces were turned away. One appeared older, maybe 19 or 20, her arm wrapped protectively around a younger one who couldn't be more than 14. They were Chinese. He realized with a start. Their dark hair was braided in a style he'd seen only a few times in town, and their clothing, torn and dirty as it was, looked nothing like what the local women wore. Blood stained the older girl's sleeve, and the younger one's face was swollen on one side like she'd been struck. The older girl looked up at him then, her dark eyes wide with terror, and something else, desperation so raw it made Jacob's chest tighten. She clutched something against her chest, what looked like a piece of green jade on a thin cord. "Please," she whispered in heavily accented English, her voice breaking. "Please don't beat us. Our mama's dying." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Jacob stood frozen in the doorway. Every instinct he'd honed over 8 years of solitude screamed at him to walk away. Strangers meant complications. Complications meant pain, and he'd had enough pain to last several lifetimes. But then the younger girl made another soft sound, a whimper that reminded him so sharply of Thomas crying that night he'd had fever that Jacob's resolve cracked like ice in spring. "You're safe here," he heard himself say, his voice rough from disuse. "No one's going to hurt you." And with those words, Jacob Mackenzie crossed a line he'd sworn he'd never cross again. He stepped back into a world where other people's pain could become his own. Mei Lin Chen had stopped believing in kindness 3 months ago, when her uncle's fist had connected with her mother's frail chest and sent the sick woman sprawling across their tiny cabin floor. Since then, every man's voice had meant danger, every footstep had promised pain. So when the mountain man, this bear, as the townspeople called him, spoke gently and stepped aside to let them pass, Mei Lin felt something crack inside her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite hope. "Come," she whispered to Xiao Yu in Cantonese, helping her younger sister to her feet. The girl's left eye was swollen nearly shut from Uncle Lu Wei's latest rage, and she moved like every bone in her body ached, which, Mei Lin knew, they probably did. The mountain man's cabin was sparse but clean, with the kind of careful order that spoke of a man who lived alone by choice rather than circumstance. Mei Lin's mother had taught her to read people through their surroundings, and everything here, from the precisely stacked firewood to the spotless cooking pot hanging over the hearth, told her this was someone who controlled what he could because too much had already spun beyond his reach. "Sit," the man said, gesturing toward a wooden chair near the fire. His English was clear but careful, like he wasn't used to talking to people. Mei Lin remained standing, one hand protectively on Xiao Yu's shoulder. Jacob, she'd heard someone in town call him that, moved slowly, deliberately, as if he understood that sudden movements would send them bolting like frightened deer. He disappeared into what must be a sleeping area and returned with strips of clean cloth and a small bottle that smelled sharp and medicinal. "Army," he said simply, noticing her questioning look. "Learned some doctoring." Mei Lin hesitated. Trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford, but Xiao Yu was swaying on her feet, and the cut on Mei Lin's own arm, where Uncle Lu Wei's knife had caught her, was beginning to throb with a heat that spoke of infection. "Xiao Yu," she said softly, guiding her sister to the chair. The mountain man knelt beside them, moving with the same deliberate care. When he reached toward Xiao Yu's injured face, Mei Lin caught his wrist. "Gentle," she said in English, the word coming out sharper than she intended. Something shifted in his eyes, a recognition of pain that went deeper than the physical. "Always," he replied, and his voice carried a weight that made Mei Lin believe him. She released his wrist and watched as he cleaned Xiaoyu's wounds with a touch so light it might have been a butterfly landing. Her sister, who had flinched at every male voice for weeks, sat perfectly still. When he finished with Xiaoyu, Jacob turned to Mei Lin. She rolled up her sleeve without being asked, revealing the angry red line where the knife had sliced through skin. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for such large hands, and when he met her eyes as he worked, she saw something she hadn't expected: respect. "Hungry?" he asked when the bandaging was done. Mei Lin's stomach answered before she could speak, growling loud enough to make Xiaoyu giggle despite everything. It was the first sound of joy her sister had made in months, and Mei Lin felt tears threaten. Jacob moved to his stores and returned with dried meat and hardtack. He ate first, a gesture Mei Lin recognized, showing the food was safe, that he wasn't trying to poison them. When she still hesitated, he pushed the food closer and stepped back, giving them space. The jerky was tough but flavorful, and the hardtack, when softened in the cup of water he provided, filled the hollow ache in Mei Lin's belly. She pulled a small cloth pouch from her inner pocket and selected dried leaves, crushing them between her palms. "Tea," she explained, hoping he'd understand. Jacob nodded and moved to the fire, returning with a pot of hot water. Mei Lin steeped the leaves, and the familiar scent of jasmine and ginger filled the cabin. When she offered him a cup, he accepted it with a small nod that felt like a victory. They sat in silence as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Mei Lin found herself studying this strange man who lived alone in the mountains. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of pain held too long, and his left hand bore a simple gold band that caught the light. A widower. Then, that explained the careful solitude, the way he moved through his space like a ghost haunting his own life. "Bad men come," she said suddenly, the English words feeling clumsy in her mouth. But he needed to understand the danger he'd brought into his carefully controlled world. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes sharp and alert. "How many?" Mei Lin held up 4 fingers, then added a 5th. "Uncle, Sheriff." She paused, searching for words. "They look for us." Something hardened in Jacob's expression. A transformation that reminded Mei Lin that this gentle man had been a soldier. "Not anymore," he said quietly. "You're under my protection now." And despite everything, despite the fear that had become her constant companion, despite the learned wariness that had kept her and Xiaoyu alive, Mei Lin found herself beginning to believe him. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows like fingers trying to get in. Jacob woke before dawn to the sound of horses approaching. 3 years of military scouting had trained his ears to distinguish between different gaits, different numbers of riders, different intentions. These horses moved with purpose, not the casual amble of travelers or the urgent pace of someone in trouble. These were hunters, and they were coming for his guests. He slipped from his bedroll on the floor. He'd given the girls his bed the night before, and moved to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see 5 riders silhouetted against the pale morning sky. The lead rider sat his horse with the arrogant bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, while the man beside him wore the tin star of a county sheriff. Mei Lin was already awake, he realized. Her dark eyes alert as she gently shook Xiaoyu, Fear radiated from both girls like heat from a fire, but they moved with practiced silence. They'd done this before, hidden, run, survived by becoming invisible. "Stay quiet," Jacob whispered. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." He checked his rifle, chambered a round, and stepped onto his porch just as the riders reached his yard. The morning air was crisp enough to show breath, and frost sparkled on the pine needles like scattered diamonds under different circumstances. It might have been beautiful. "Mackenzie," the sheriff called out, touching the brim of his hat with mock politeness. "Heard you might have seen some runaway property." Jacob's jaw tightened at the word property, but he kept his voice level. "Morning, Morrison. Don't see much of anybody up here, that's generally the point." The man beside the sheriff urged his horse forward. He was smaller than Jacob had expected, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of casual cruelty. This had to be Uncle Lu Wei, the man who'd put those bruises on Xiao Yu's face. "I am Chen Lu Wei," the man said in heavily accented English. "I look for my nieces, 2 girls, very young, very foolish. They run away from family responsibility." "Haven't seen any girls," Jacob replied, "Chinese or otherwise." Uncle Chen's eyes narrowed. "You lie, mountain man. They come this way. I have witnesses." "Well, your witnesses are mistaken." Jacob shifted slightly, a movement that put his right hand closer to the rifle, leaning against the porch rail. "Might want to check the main road. Lots of folks pass through there." Sheriff Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Now, Bear, we all know you're not the most social of men, but harboring criminals is a serious offense." "What's their crime?" Jacob asked. "Being born Chinese?" "Theft," Uncle Chen said smoothly. "They steal from family, take what belongs to me." "Such as?" "Personal property, family heirlooms, very valuable." Jacob studied the man's face, noting the slight tick at the corner of his left eye, the way his hands tightened on the reins when he spoke. This was a man lying through his teeth, and not particularly well. "Like I said," Jacob repeated. "Haven't seen them." The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Uncle Chen's men, 3 hard-looking types who carried their guns like they knew how to use them, shifted restlessly in their saddles. Jacob counted distances, calculated angles, remembered the layout of cover around his cabin. If this went bad, he'd need every advantage. "You know," Sheriff Morrison said conversationally, "it occurs to me we haven't inspected your property in a while. Make sure you're following all the territorial laws, environmental regulations, tax assessments." The threat was clear enough. Cooperate, or they'd find ways to make his life difficult. In the old days, before Sarah and Thomas, Jacob might have told them exactly where they could shove their regulations, but 8 years of solitude had taught him the value of picking his battles. "Feel free to look around," he said. "Just remember, this is private property. Wouldn't want any accidents." Uncle Chen's face flushed with anger. "All Chinese must be returned to proper authority. This is law. And I'm sure Sheriff Morrison here knows all about proper legal procedures," Jacob replied, his tone suggesting he thought no such thing. Morrison's jaw worked like he was chewing on something unpleasant. "We'll be back. Mackenzie, count on it." As the riders wheeled their horses and headed back down the mountain, Uncle Chen called over his shoulder, "Mountain man, you cannot hide from justice forever. What you protect will bring you only sorrow." Jacob waited until the hoofbeats faded completely before going back inside. Mei Lin and Xiao Yu emerged from behind the wood box where they'd been hiding, both pale but steady. "Uncle Lu Wei," Mei Lin said unnecessarily. "Yeah, I figured." Jacob moved to the window. scanning the tree line for any signs the men had left watchers behind. "Tell me about this theft," he mentioned. Mei Lin's hand went instinctively to the jade pendant at her throat. "He lies. We take nothing that was not ours. But there's something," Jacob pressed, "something he wants badly enough to involve the law." For a long moment, Mei Lin said nothing. Then she reached into her clothing and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. When she unwrapped it, Jacob saw what looked like a hand-drawn map, with Chinese characters and rough sketches of mountain landmarks. "My father's mine," she said quietly. "Before he die, he find silver, much silver. Uncle Lu Wei. He want claim for himself. But," she struggled with the English, "need us alive to make legal." Jacob stared at the map, understanding flooding through him like cold water. This wasn't about runaway family members. This was about money, pure and simple. And Uncle Chen needed the girls alive to maintain his legal claim to their father's discovery, which meant they were all in more danger than he'd realized. "Well," Jacob said, folding the map and handing it back to her, "I reckon that changes things." Outside, a raven cawed once and went silent. Even the birds could sense the storm coming. Evening fell across the mountains like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in years, Jacob found himself grateful for company around his fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, while wind whispered through the pine boughs outside, carrying the promise of an early winter. Mei Lin sat cross-legged on the floor, teaching Xiao Yu to braid thin strips of leather while they waited for the rabbit stew to finish cooking. The domestic scene should have felt strange in Jacob's carefully ordered solitude, but instead it felt right, like something that had been missing without him realizing it. "Your father," Jacob said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Tell me about him." Mei Lin's hands stilled on the leather strips. When she looked up, her dark eyes held the kind of pain Jacob recognized, the weight of loss that never quite stopped aching. "Chen Wei Ming," she said. "He come to America with big dreams, work very hard in mines, save money, bring family from China." Her English was improving, he noticed, becoming more fluid as she relaxed. "He good man, kind man, always say America is place where hard work brings reward." "What happened to him?" "Accident," Mei Lin said. But the way she spoke the word made it clear she believed no such thing. "Rock fall in mine. Uncle Lu Wei. He say, very sad, very unfortunate. Take care of family now." Jacob stirred the stew, considering. "But your father found something before he died." Mei Lin glanced at Xiao Yu, who had curled up near the fire and was fighting sleep. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days before accident, Papa come home very excited. Say he finds something wonderful, something that change everything for our family. Show Mama the map, make her promise to keep secret." Mei Lin's hands clenched into fists. Next day, Uncle Lu Wei visit, ask many questions about Papa's work. Day after that. She didn't need to finish. Jacob had seen enough accidents during the war to know how easy it was to arrange one. "Your uncle killed him for a mining claim." "Cannot prove," Mei Lin said bitterly. "Uncle Lu Wei, very smart, very careful. Make sure accident look real." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally, he said, "My wife was named Sarah. My son was Thomas." Mei Lin looked up sharply, surprised by the sudden shift. "Cholera took them while I was away on a scouting mission," Jacob continued. 3 weeks I was gone. tracking Confederate sympathizers through the mountains. When I came back, he swallowed hard. Neighbors said it happened fast. Said there was nothing anyone could have done. You blame yourself, Maylin said softly. It wasn't a question. Should have been there. Should have protected them. Jacob's voice was rough with old pain. Instead, I was playing soldier, chasing ghosts while my family died alone. You could not know. Could have chosen differently, could have stayed home. Jacob met her eyes across the fire. Point is, I understand about loss, about guilt, about carrying weight that never gets lighter. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and Xiao Yu's soft breathing. Finally, Mei Lin spoke again. Uncle Lu Wei. He tells Sheriff Morrison we steal family treasure, make it legal to hunt us. But real treasure. She touched the map hidden in her clothing. Papa's silver mine. Uncle need us alive to maintain claim. But once he get legal papers, she shrugged eloquently. He'll sell you to the highest bidder and work your sister to death in the mines. Jacob finished. Yes. Jacob stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. They'll be back. Morrison's crooked as a dog's hind leg, and your uncle's got money to keep him interested. We bring danger to you, Mei Lin said. We go tomorrow. Find other place. No. The word came out sharper than Jacob intended. He turned back to face her. You're not going anywhere. Something flickered in Mei Lin's eyes. Surprise. Hope. Fear. You not understand. They kill you if you help us. Let them try. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small cabin. Then Mei Lin rose gracefully and moved to where Jacob stood by the window. She was smaller than Sarah had been, more delicate in build, but there was steel in her spine that spoke of strength forged in fire. Why? She asked simply. Jacob looked down at her upturned face, at the determined set of her jaw and the quiet courage in her dark eyes. 8 years of isolation had taught him to be careful with words, to weigh each one before speaking. But standing here in the firelight, with this brave woman who'd risked everything to protect her sister, the truth came easier than he'd expected. Because you remind me what it feels like to be alive, he said quietly. Mei Lin's breath caught, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. Then she reached up and touched his face with fingers that trembled slightly. Jacob, she whispered, and the way she said his name made something tight in his chest finally loosen. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the uncaring stars. But inside the cabin, beside the warm fire, 2 damaged souls began the delicate process of learning to trust again. Tomorrow would bring fresh dangers. Tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Jacob Mackenzie didn't feel quite so alone. Dawn came gray and cold, with snow clouds gathering over the peaks like an army preparing for battle. Jacob woke to find Mei Lin already up, moving quietly around the cabin as she prepared breakfast. The domestic sight hit him with unexpected warmth, followed immediately by a stab of fear. He'd forgotten how much it hurt to have something worth losing. Sleep well? He asked, noting the careful way she moved, like someone listening for trouble even in sleep. Better than in long time, she admitted, ladling porridge into wooden bowls. But they come back today. I feel it. Jacob nodded grimly. He felt it too, that electric tension in the air that preceded violence. The same feeling he'd learned to recognize during the war. Uncle Chen wouldn't wait long. Men like that, When they wanted something, they took it. "Then we'd best get ready," he said. After breakfast, Jacob began pulling weapons from their hiding places throughout the cabin. Mei Lin watched with growing amazement as he produced rifle after rifle, boxes of ammunition, even a pair of Navy Colts wrapped in oiled leather. "You expect war?" she asked. "Always," Jacob replied. "Learned in the army. Hope for peace. Prepare for hell." He handed her one of the revolvers, noting how naturally her hand curved around the grip. "You've held a gun before." "Papa teach me little," she said. "Uncle Lu Wei, he not know." "Good. Keep it that way." Jacob showed her how to check the cylinder, how to sight down the barrel. "Remember, if you have to shoot, shoot to kill." Wounded men are often the most dangerous. While Jacob prepared their defenses, Mei Lin worked on her own preparations. She showed him pressure points that could drop a man without killing him, how to use common household items as weapons, where to strike to cause maximum pain with minimum effort. Chinese medicine, she explained when he raised an eyebrow at her knowledge. To heal, must first understand how body can be hurt. They spent the morning creating a network of defensive positions around the cabin. Jacob's military training came flooding back as he positioned rifles at strategic windows, prepared ammunition caches, and planned fields of fire. Mei Lin proved surprisingly adept at the tactical thinking, suggesting improvements that showed a sharp understanding of their situation. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," Jacob said as they finished camouflaging a rifle pit behind the woodshed. "Women survive by being smarter than men think," Mei Lin replied with a slight smile. Is old truth. By midday, they'd transformed Jacob's peaceful cabin into a small fortress. Every approach was covered. Every window offered a clear field of fire. And they'd prepared multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest. As they worked, Jacob found himself stealing glances at Mei Lin. There was something about the way she moved, the quiet competence with which she handled each task, that reminded him of Sarah. But where Sarah had been gentle and trusting, Mei Lin was steel wrapped in silk, beautiful but deadly when threatened. "Jacob," she said as they shared a simple lunch of bread and cheese. "After this, after Uncle Lu Wei." She struggled with the words. "After we stop him," Jacob said firmly. "Yes, after. What then?" It was a question Jacob had been avoiding all morning. What came after? If they survived, and that was a significant if, what future could they possibly have together? A Chinese woman and a mountain hermit in 1882 Colorado Territory, the world wasn't ready for such things, but looking at Mei Lin's face, seeing the quiet hope in her dark eyes, Jacob found he didn't care what the world was ready for. "Then we figure it out together," he said. Mei Lin's smile was like sunrise after a long night. She reached across the small table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "Together," she repeated, testing the word like a promise. They might have said more, might have spoken of futures and possibilities, but Xiao Yu suddenly appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Men coming," she whispered in English. "Many men." Jacob was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Through the trees, he could see riders approaching, more than before. Uncle Chen had brought reinforcements. "How many?" Mei Lin asked, appearing beside him with her revolver already in hand. Jacob counted quickly. 8, plus your uncle and Morrison. He looked at her seriously. "That's long odds." "We have advantages," Mei Lin said calmly. We know ground. We know what we fight for. And what's that? She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything: hope and fear, love and determination, the fierce protective instinct that had kept her and Xiao Yu alive this long. Family, she said simply. Outside, the riders had stopped just beyond rifle range. Uncle Chen's voice carried clearly in the mountain air. Mountain man, you have 1 hour to return my property. After that, we come and take what is ours. Jacob moved to the window and called back. Come ahead, Chen. Let's finish this. As the riders withdrew to wait, Jacob turned to find Mei Lin watching him with something like awe. What? He asked. In China, we have saying, she said softly. The mountain does not come to the man, so the man must go to the mountain. Meaning, sometimes you must choose to fight for what matters. She stepped closer, rising on her toes to brush her lips against his in a kiss that tasted of courage and desperate hope. Thank you for choosing to fight. Outside, the clouds had thickened, and the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. Winter was coming early this year, but Jacob no longer felt the cold. For the first time in 8 years, he had something worth fighting for, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take it away. The attack came with the gray dawn, just as Jacob had expected. Uncle Chen's men moved through the snow-laden pines like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the fresh powder that had fallen during the night. But Jacob had been a scout for too long to be caught off guard. He'd been awake since 4, watching, waiting, counting muzzle flashes, and planning his response. 5 from the east, he whispered to Mei Lin, who crouched beside him at the front window. 3 circling south, your uncle and Morrison staying back with the horses. Mei Lin nodded, her face calm despite the tremor in her hands. Behind them, Xiao Yu huddled in the root cellar Jacob had cleared out, surrounded by enough food and water to last 3 days if necessary. The first shot came from the tree line, a rifle crack that sent splinters flying from the cabin's wall just inches from Jacob's head. He returned fire immediately, his bullet finding its mark in the shoulder of a man who'd thought the fallen log provided adequate cover. Now they know we're serious, Jacob said grimly, working the lever action to chamber another round. The battle erupted in earnest then, gunfire crackling through the mountain air like deadly fireworks. Jacob's preparations paid off as he moved between his prepared positions, using interior passages he'd cut between rooms to avoid exposing himself to enemy fire. Mei Lin proved herself a quick study, following his directions and adding her own innovations. Smoke, she called out, pointing to where one of Uncle Chen's men was trying to set fire to the cabin's back wall. Without hesitation, she slipped out through the rear window Jacob had prepared as an escape route, moving through the snow like a ghost. Jacob watched through the back window as Mei Lin approached the would-be arsonist from behind. She moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in the old ways, and when she struck, the man dropped like a sack of grain. She was back inside before Jacob could properly worry about her. Pressure point behind ear, she explained breathlessly. He sleep for long time. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Jacob said, impressed despite the circumstances. The siege settled into a deadly rhythm. Uncle Chen's men had numbers and ammunition, but Jacob had position and experience. More importantly, he was fighting for something that mattered, while they were just following orders for pay. The tide began to turn when one of the hired gunmen grew impatient. Instead of maintaining his cover, he made a run for the cabin's front door, probably thinking he could kick it in and end the fight quickly. Jacob's rifle bullet caught him center mass. dropping him in the snow just 10 feet from the porch. "Anyone else feeling brave?" Jacob called out. The answer came in the form of intensified gunfire. But Jacob could tell Uncle Chen's men were getting nervous. They'd signed up for easy money, not a protracted battle against a prepared defender. Then, everything changed. Jacob Maylin's scream cut through the gunfire like a knife. He spun to see Uncle Chen himself climbing through the back window, the same one Maylin had used earlier. The man must have circled around during the fighting, using the battle as a distraction. Uncle Chen had his arm around Xiao Yu's throat, a knife pressed to her neck. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't struggling. Smart girl. She knew any sudden movement could be fatal. "Enough," Uncle Chen snarled. "Drop weapons, or little bird dies." Jacob's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, but the angle was wrong. Any shot he took risked hitting Xiao Yu. Beside him, Maylin had gone rigid, her revolver trained on her uncle, but her hands shaking with fury and fear. "Let her go," Maylin said in English, then repeated it in rapid Cantonese. Uncle Chen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You cost me much money, niece, much trouble." "Time to pay." "The map," Jacob said quietly to Maylin. "Give him what he wants." "No," Maylin said firmly. "He kill us all anyway, is his nature." She was right, Jacob realized. Men like Uncle Chen didn't leave witnesses, especially not witnesses who could testify to murder and theft. They were all dead unless... Moving purely on instinct, Jacob did something that 8 years ago would have been unthinkable. He dropped his rifle and stepped directly into Uncle Chen's line of fire. "You want to kill someone," he said calmly. "Kill me. Leave the girls out of it." Uncle Chen's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with calculation. "Noble mountain man, but stupid. I take map from dead hands just as easy." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Xiao Yu, showing more courage than any 14-year-old should ever need, suddenly went limp in Uncle Chen's grasp. The unexpected dead weight threw him off balance just enough for his knife hand to waver. Maylin moved like lightning, her revolver barking once. Uncle Chen staggered backward, blood spreading across his chest, his knife clattering to the floor, and Jacob, seeing his chance, dove forward to catch Xiao Yu as she fell, outside. The gunfire had stopped. Uncle Chen's remaining men, hearing their employer's death cry, were apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. Uncle Chen lay on his back, blood frothing at his lips, his eyes already growing dim. With his last breath, he whispered something in Cantonese that made Maylin's face go white. "What did he say?" Jacob asked. "He say, he not the only one who want the silver," Maylin translated. "He say others will come." Jacob looked down at the dead man, then at the map that had cost so many lives, then at the 2 brave women who'd somehow become his family. "Let them come," he said quietly. "We'll be ready." Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice echoed through the mountains. "This ain't over, Mackenzie." But Jacob was no longer listening to threats. He was too busy holding the people who mattered most, feeling grateful to be alive and planning for whatever came next. The siege was over. The war, however, was just beginning. Spring came early to the Colorado Territory that year, as if the mountains themselves were eager to wash away the memory of violence with snowmelt and wildflowers. Jacob stood on his porch, their porch now, watching Maylin tend the garden she'd planted behind the cabin. 3 months had passed since the siege. 3 months of healing and learning and building something neither of them had expected to find. The legal aftermath had been surprisingly simple. Federal marshals. Alerted by a letter Jacob had written to his former commanding officer, had arrived 2 weeks after Uncle Chen's death to investigate reports of corruption in the territorial government. Sheriff Morrison, faced with evidence of his dealings with Uncle Chen, had confessed everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. The mining claim had been legally transferred to Mei Lin as her father's rightful heir, and Jacob had been cleared of any wrongdoing in Uncle Chen's death. More importantly, the federal investigation had exposed a network of exploitation targeting Chinese miners throughout the territory. Other families, emboldened by Mei Lin's courage, had come forward with their own stories of abuse and theft. Justice, it seemed, sometimes moved slowly, but arrived nonetheless. "Jacob," Mei Lin called from the garden, straightening with a handful of early carrots. "Come see." He walked over to where she knelt among the neat rows of vegetables. Noting how the sun caught the blue-black highlights in her hair, she'd started wearing it loose around her shoulders instead of in the severe braids she'd favored during their first desperate weeks together. The change suited her, made her look younger and more carefree. "Look," she said, pointing to a corner of the garden where Xiao Yu had planted flowers from seeds their mother had brought from China. Delicate pink blossoms were just beginning to open, their petals unfurling like tiny prayers of hope. "Beautiful," Jacob said, but he wasn't looking at the flowers. Mei Lin's cheeks flushed, and she ducked her head with the shy smile that never failed to make his heart skip. Even after 3 months, even after everything they'd been through together, she still seemed surprised by his attention, as if she couldn't quite believe someone could love her simply for who she was. "The mining engineer comes tomorrow," she said, changing the subject to safer ground, "to survey Papa's claim." Jacob nodded. They'd decided to develop the silver mine slowly, carefully, bringing in partners who would treat Chinese workers fairly rather than rushing to extract maximum profit. It meant less money in the short term, but it also meant they could sleep at night knowing they weren't perpetuating the cycle of exploitation that had killed Mei Lin's father. "Nervous?" he asked. "Little bit," she admitted. "Is big responsibility, Papa's dream, but also our future. Their future." The words still sent a thrill through Jacob every time he heard them. 6 months ago, he'd been a man with no past except grief and no future except solitude. And now he found himself planning years ahead, imagining the cabin expanded to accommodate a growing family, picturing children playing in the meadow where he'd once walked alone. "Speaking of our future," Jacob said, reaching into his pocket, "I have something for you." Mei Lin's eyes widened as he pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs he'd worked on during the long winter evenings. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to reveal a simple gold band, not the elaborate ring a wealthy man might buy, but honest metal shaped with his own hands. "Mei Lin Chen," he said, dropping to one knee right there in the garden dirt. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, she stared at the ring as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then tears began to run down her cheeks, and Jacob felt a moment of panic. "If you don't want—" he began. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, of course yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, noting how perfectly it fit, how right it looked there. When he stood, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the passion and joy she'd been holding back for months. "Xiao Yu will be so happy," Mei Lin said when they finally broke apart. "She asks me every day when you make honest woman of me." Jacob laughed. Smart girl. Probably knows more about what's going on than either of us. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, and Jacob felt the last piece of his carefully constructed emotional armor finally fall away. For 8 years, he'd carried guilt like a stone in his chest, convinced that loving someone meant risking unbearable loss. But Mei Lin had taught him that the greater risk was in not loving at all, that a life without connection wasn't really living. Inside the cabin, Xiao Yu looked up from the book she was reading. Her English had improved dramatically over the winter, and immediately noticed the ring on her sister's finger. Finally, she exclaimed, jumping up to hug them both. I think maybe Jacob, too, scared to ask. Was not scared, Jacob protested. Was being thoughtful. Both sisters looked at him with identical expressions of amused disbelief. And Jacob realized this was his life now, being outnumbered by clever women who could see right through him. Strangely, he found he didn't mind at all. That evening, as they sat around the fire planning their wedding, Jacob found himself thinking about the graves behind the cabin. Sarah and Thomas would always be part of him. But their memory no longer felt like a weight he had to carry alone. Instead, it felt like a foundation on which to build something new and beautiful. June wedding? Mei Lin suggested. When flowers are full bloom? June sounds perfect, Jacob agreed. Outside, night was falling over the mountains, but inside the cabin, everything was warmth and light and the promise of tomorrow. Jacob Mackenzie, who had once been the loneliest man in Colorado Territory, had found his way home at last. And as Mei Lin's hand found his in the firelight, he realized that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that brought you back to yourself, changed, healed, and ready to love again. In the end, this story reminds us that the walls we build to protect ourselves from pain often become the very prisons that keep us from joy. True strength isn't found in isolation or emotional armor, but in the courage to remain open to love, even when our hearts have been broken before, when we choose compassion over fear, when we extend our hand to a stranger in need. We don't just change their world, we transform our own. The most profound healing happens not in solitude, but in the sacred space between two souls who choose to trust again. Perhaps the greatest truth here is that love doesn't discriminate based on background, culture, or circumstance. It flows like water, finding its way around every barrier we place in its path. When we dare to see beyond our differences, when we recognize the shared humanity in every face, we discover that our capacity for connection is infinite. The family we choose often becomes more precious than the one we're born into. And home isn't a place on any map. It's wherever we're truly known and completely accepted. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more tales of courage and love, and follow us for stories that celebrate the best of human nature.